Chapter 16. The doctor picked his way through the carnage. The mummies lay across each other, crumpled and limp, their power suddenly gone. Discoloured areas of dust marked the positions where Rasul, the relics, and Nephthys's arm had disintegrated. The time tunnel was strobing a reassuring green, the light diminishing as they watched. The doctor reached round the back of the sarcophagus for a moment, then straightened up, dusted the palms of his hands against each other, and beamed across at Tegan and the others. There, that should do it. Don't want the thermal balance to equalise just yet, do we? There'll be quite a fire in this enclosed space, and I'd rather it was a few hours from now. The house should be safe, but it will destroy the incriminating evidence down here. He looked at the fallen mummies and the stained stonework. The sands of time wash us all clean, he said quietly. Then he brightened. Still, all's well that ends well, eh? And with that, he strode back across the room and slapped Tegan on the shoulder. She pulled away. Is that it? She asked. Her voice was vibrant with suppressed emotion. The doctor seemed not to notice. Yes, I think so. Pretty good result considering. All over. Doctor! Tegan screamed at him, her whole body tense with anger. Bar the shouting, the doctor frowned, his eyebrows knitting together as he leaned towards her. Yes? He asked irritably. Tegan turned away, arms folded. What is it? The doctor asked the group collectively. What's wrong with her now? I think she might be worried about Nissa, Atkins suggested quietly. Nissa? Oh, yes. I nearly forgot. The doctor fumbled in his pocket and drew out the TARDIS key. Well, let's go and wake her up then. The old woman who had woken in the sarcophagus followed the doctor to the TARDIS. It was only after he had unlocked the door and ushered her in ahead of him that he seemed to realise that nobody else was following. They were standing, open-mouthed, watching him from the other side of the dais. Well, are you coming or not? He demanded. Tegan and Atkins looked at each other in silence. May I be permitted to ask what's going on? Atkins had followed Tegan into Nissa's room, only to be confronted with yet another puzzle. The old woman he had been told was Nissa was sitting in a chair beside the bed. She patted the hand of the young woman who lay on the bed, a young woman who might have been her granddaughter, except that even across the years between them, the resemblance between the two was uncanny. A small piece of machinery that looked like it was cobbled together out of wires, small boxes, and sealing wax, sat humming quietly to itself on the floor beside the bed. The doctor was just disconnecting it from the young woman on the bed as they entered. As he switched off the machine, the hum died away, and the young woman yawned and stretched. That's the delta wave augmenter, isn't it, Doctor? Tegan asked. He nodded, without taking his attention from the sleeping woman. Yes, though I had to rig up another delta source to replace the sonic screwdriver, of course. Atkins coughed politely. Doctor, I take it that this young woman is your friend Nissa, but perhaps you could introduce us all? The doctor stepped back from the bed, apparently satisfied with Nissa's progress. Of course, he said. He turned to the old woman. Do forgive me, but things have been a little hectic for formal introductions. Not at all, Doctor. I quite understand. She let go of Nissa's hand and stood up. Tegan, of course, I know already. But your other friend? Mr. Atkins. Atkins inclined his head slightly. Delighted. Tegan was frowning. Do I know you? Of course, my dear. And you haven't changed a bit. The woman smiled, and the way her face suddenly brightened made her look younger. Though I must confess, I have. Tegan shook her head slowly. Then her mouth dropped open. "Anne?" The woman nodded. "I'm Lady Cranley now. Have been for a very long time. The doctor came to the wedding, you know." She smiled at him, and he beamed back. "When?" Tegan asked. "In 1926, Lady Cranley said. "About 3 hours ago," said the doctor. Atkins coughed politely. "Ah, yes. An explanation." The doctor shuffled his feet uncomfortably. "Well, this is Lady Cranley, née Anne Talbot, an old friend." He paused, apparently embarrassed by his choice of words. "Forgive me," he said to Lady Cranley. "Of course. But you're right." The doctor continued. "Anne was the image of Nyssa when we first met. Even I couldn't tell them apart. So I asked Lady Cranley if she would do me a small favour and stand in for Nyssa." "So she was in fact merely feigning sleep?" Atkins asked. Lady Cranley laughed. "I had to lie very still and wait for a password from the doctor. All terribly exciting. Yes, I do apologise for the melodramatics, and for not telling you all what was going on, especially you, Tegan. But I had to make sure that Nephthys was convinced that this was Nyssa, and that she had been semi-awake, just enough to age, for 70 years. Rasool would never have believed I could do it if your reactions weren't genuine." Tegan said, "So when Nephthys looked in Anne's head for the other half of her own mind, it wasn't there, of course. And she thought it had sort of evaporated in 1926 and went back to look for it?" Atkins asked. "Exactly." The doctor punctuated the word with a stab of his index finger. "And when she found Nyssa was still asleep, she sort of bounced back?" The doctor nodded. "She was able to tell when Nyssa would wake, so she came forward to that point. But because she could only act on instinct and impulse," he left the thought unfinished for them, "she kept going back and forth in time till she aged to death." Tegan laughed. "Simple. Sometimes, Tegan," the doctor said, "you take my breath away." "And what, Doctor, happens now?" asked Atkins. The doctor picked up a canopic jar from the floor under Nyssa's bed. "Well, if you'll excuse me just a moment, I think Nyssa is about ready to wake up. And there's something in her mind I would like to remove." The top was shaped into the head of a jackal, and he gave it a sharp twist to unscrew it. "A siren technology, complete with generator loop." "With what?" "A sort of force field," he explained. "I picked it up at the British Museum on the way to collect Lady Cranley. Wouldn't have worked for Rasool and his friends, though. But now that I've built in a few modifications and refinements, it should be up to the task." "Rasool? I thought he was the bad guy." "Oh, indeed." The doctor held the jar up and inspected it as if he had never seen it before. "But initially he was the guy, as you say, that Horus left to guard the tomb. When Nephthys' energy leaked out, she used his suppressed guilt at sacrificing his daughter to turn him against Horus and into her servant. Quite handy from her point of view, since Horus was already expending the energy to keep him alive." The doctor held the open jar close in front of Nyssa's face. A wire from the cat's cradle contraption he had been fiddling with earlier was connected to the base of the canopic jar. Suddenly, the doctor snapped his fingers. The noise was like a pistol shot, and Nyssa's eyes snapped open. For a moment they burned with a brightness and intelligence that almost radiated with intensity. Then they dulled slightly, and she blinked. The doctor jammed the stopper on the jar and twisted it shut. Then he pulled away the wire and gave a loud exhalation of relief. "Doctor?" Nyssa lifted her head slightly from the pillows. She looked up at all the people crowding round her bed. "What's happening?" Her eyes flickered and she yawned. "I've had the strangest dream," she said. The doctor smiled. "Don't worry about it, Nissa. Everything's fine now." Nissa seemed to have drifted back into sleep, and the doctor waved everyone from the room. "I know it seems odd," he said as he led them back to the console room, "but she'll be quite tired, I think. She might sleep for a little while." Tegan looked sharply at him. "I mean, maybe an hour or two." It seemed as if, despite his frequent protestations, the TARDIS was becoming a taxi service. The doctor had taken Lady Cranley back to Oxfordshire. Atkins had bid a sincere farewell, actually with tears in his eyes, before leaving them outside the back entrance to Kenilworth House a century earlier. Nissa was feeling rather weak and drained, so Tegan explained what had been going on. Nissa seemed to be taking the news with characteristic composure. The doctor welcomed the few minutes he had to himself. He looked back at the TARDIS, shimmering in the intense dry heat, then continued on his way. He half ran, half slid down the sand, remembering his similar descent with Atkins earlier. The empty shell of the pyramid afforded some relief from the efforts of the sun, but the air was still close and hot. When he reached the area that had been the main burial chamber, he calculated the position of the point on the floor he was looking for. He couldn't be sure, of course, but the Asirans put a lot of store in geometric patterns and exact points in space. Horus must, he reflected as he started to dig into the sandy remains of the floor with his hands, have chosen this place for a reason. When the hole was big enough, the doctor carefully placed the canopic jar inside. Then he covered it over with the sand he had scooped out. He stood, bowed slightly, and made the sign of the eye. As he left the main door of the pyramid, it swung slowly shut behind him. When the doctor reached the TARDIS, he turned and looked back into the crater in the sand. He nodded in quiet satisfaction and opened the TARDIS door. The TARDIS shimmered in the heat of the day and faded from existence. A moment later, a trickle of sand started running down the crater sides. Perhaps the doctor had dislodged it. Perhaps the TARDIS had shaken the ground slightly as it left. Perhaps there was a sudden, inexplicable breeze skitting across the desert. But whatever the cause, the trickle grew into a river of sand flowing down into the crater. Before long, it was an avalanche, filling the bottom of the hollow. By the time Orion rose in the night sky, all signs of the Black Pyramid of Nethsis were buried deep beneath the shifting desert sands. "Did you find him all right?" It took Atkins a few moments to realise what Lord Kenilworth was asking him. It was a long while since he had departed to deliver an invitation to the doctor outside the British Museum. He smiled. "Indeed, sir, and I must say I'm very glad I did." Kenilworth grunted. "Didn't take you long. Didn't think you'd be back until after I'd turned in." Atkins smiled and watched his employer start up the stairs. Then he continued on his way to the kitchens. He felt a nervous excitement above and beyond anything he'd experienced during his time with the doctor and Tegan, and his throat felt as dry as if he were still in the desert. Miss Warne was standing by the stove. She was stirring a saucepan of soup. Atkins watched her from the doorway for a while. Her mind was obviously not on the task in hand. She was staring off into space and humming quietly. Atkins shook his head. Such a lack of proper decorum and deplorable laxity of attitude. "Miss Warne," he called across the room. She flinched and turned. She had stopped humming at once, and her stance was somehow more upright and proper. But in her eyes he saw a flicker of emotion, a moment of suppressed happiness. "I didn't realise before," Atkins said as he crossed the room, Just how long you must have been prepared to stand here and stir soup on the off chance that I should remember your kind offer and avail myself of it." "I don't mind waiting up." If she was surprised at his comment, she hid it well. Her head was tilted slightly to one side so that the dark hair fell away slightly. Atkins could see the edge of her ear beneath. He did not remember ever having seen her ear before, and he was struck by how round and perfect it looked. Pale skin beneath dark hair. "If I didn't know better," Atkins said, leaning over her shoulder to inspect the soup, "I might think that you enjoyed waiting for me." "If you didn't know better—" Without changing position, Atkins looked up from the saucepan. His face was close to hers, and he could see that her pale skin was now slightly more pink than a few moments previously. He looked deep into her large, dark eyes. Miss Warne turned away. "Forgive me," Atkins said, "but may I address you as Susan for a moment?" She looked back at him, puzzled. "Mr. Atkins, why?" He smiled. "It makes a proposal to have dinner together seem so much less formal. That's all." Kenilworth was not sure quite what the change in Atkins was, but certainly he had changed. He seemed more like he had been on the recent expedition than the sudden reversion to type after they had returned. But there was more to it than that. Kenilworth waited for Atkins to show in his dinner guest and reflected again on the events of the past few months, trying to put his finger on what was going on. His wife had mentioned that the housekeeper, too, seemed strangely distracted. Atkins held the door open and stood to one side to let the guest enter. He was a tall, lean young man, with a hooked nose and dark hair that was already starting to recede. Kenilworth rose to greet the newest member of the Royal Society. "Professor Marcus Scarman," Atkins announced.